Order, order. This is the second session in our inquiry into buses connecting communities, where overall we're looking at the chronic lack of reliable bus and public transport outside of the main conurbations and often even the centre of main conurbations. And we're looking at how the government could improve on these and tackle the decline in reliable bus services, and whether also the government's bus reforms are fit for purpose to tackle this England-wide crisis. This morning we're considering how effective or otherwise demand-responsive travel and community transport services have proven to be, and how or whether the government could do more to support them. So could I ask our panel to introduce themselves and your roles?
Yeah, sure. Max Sugarman, I'm Chief Executive of Intelligent Transport Systems UK. We're the industry association for transport technology and represent 180 organisations in the space.
Good morning, my name's James West. I'm representing Padam Mobility. I look after their growth here in the UK. We're part of the wider Siemens network, and more specifically here in the UK, part of Siemens Mobility, which is known for its rail. We're a software provider to about 10 schemes here in the UK.
Hi, I'm Caroline Whitney. I'm the Director for England and Head of Membership at the Community Transport Association. So we are the leading body that represents all non-commercial operators across the UK. We currently have 1,300 members, about 900 of those operate in England. We are also the largest designated body and issuer of Section 19 permits in the UK or in GB. We currently have around 6,000 active permits operated by 835 organisations.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions on demand response transport, DRT. So what is DRT and how does it currently fit into the wider public transport network?
So if I go first, DRT is ultimately about providing more flexible services for a local populace. So really it's about not having a fixed route and moving to basically support the communities in a certain area. It's worth saying there's not one form of DRT. That it can be zonal, so it could work in a particular community, but it could also work in terms of a fixed route but just without bus stops, or in terms of feeding into a railway station or a fixed route bus network. So there's lots of different varieties. In the UK, it's mostly zonal that we have in terms of DRT services, and it's particularly got applications in rural areas. But it's worth saying also is DRT in terms of urban areas, and particularly for things like non-urgent hospital visits, for SEN transport as well, and for also corporate travel when there's a lot of employees in a set area. An employer might choose to use DRT to get them in. So it's quite a flexible, dynamic service that can be used in a variety of ways.
Anything to add, James?
I think just to add, in terms of the layer that we add with a software provider, is we add some sort of technology provider element to it, so people can book sometimes through a website or an app. I'll leave to Karen in a second around the elements around digital versus DRT itself. And like Max said, I think the flexibility is kind of that element that really brings the benefit. It's very almost different flavours for different needs, and we can sort of blend those all together to make the solution work best for the local authority and their residents.
Thank you, because I think it's important that we make a distinction between DRT and digital DRT. Obviously, there's a strong overlap, but not everyone who's a user of DRT has access to digital connectivity, and even those with smartphones in some parts of rural areas, there is no mobile connectivity. So does that present challenges? In general, the sort of distinction between the two, and where are the benefits?
I think DRT has been around for a long time in the sense of, people have been using non-fixed route or dynamic transport to support areas for a while. What has changed, I'd say, in the last 10 years is really the use of algorithms and data to better understand and better, have more flexible dynamic services that, someone books on their app and can be, the minibus or the vehicle can be rerouted to pick them up, optimising the best route as part of the system. So that has changed, and that has provided a huge amount of benefits for DRT. I think in terms of just the phone element, a large, if not, vast majority of DRT services operate a dial-a-ride as well, operate a phone system, and what we see is actually a lot of DRT services start off using the phone system quite heavily, getting people to dial in, and increasingly more and more people use the app as they transition for that. I think there was one example of a local authority that saw over the first year about 60% increase in the app usage over the phone. But it is important that that phone element's kept in and that people are able to use that as well, not just because of digital connectivity, but also accessibility.
And how do DRT services compare on the one hand to a traditional bus service and on the other to a standard minicab service?
Yeah. So I would say it's a shared mobility service, which is perhaps the difference to a minicab service. There's also no fixed defined route, so it's purely driven on demand. If I want to go to the train station and Caroline and Max are looking to also travel to the train station perhaps at a similar time, we would group those journeys together. And there's a case of if he actually wanted to travel at say 1:45 and there was a journey travelling at 10 to, then we are travelling those together. The stops as well, in comparison to a fixed bus route, sometimes they use traditional bus infrastructure, sometimes they use what we call virtual stops, which can be at the end of a corner of a road. And similarly, in terms of the actual duration, it's kind of, you get a window of which your journey will take place, which with a minicab you're sometimes told where you'll be picked up, and a bus has like a very rigid timetable that you'll respect and obey.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
Thank you, Chair. The consultation response on DRT, there's quite a few people responding saying that they didn't think DRT was scalable and they thought that it was always going to be expensive. Is that the case?
So I would disagree with that in a number of cases. There's different DRT schemes all throughout the UK, and it's worth saying that local authorities do try different things, and the dynamic nature of DRT means you can try and then amend a scheme. But what we've seen, so an example, Milton Keynes and Milton Keynes Connect, they had a fixed route which was at £13 per passenger subsidy. They got that down to £4. We saw that in Nottinghamshire, they had an £18 per passenger subsidy, and they got that down to about £9.
Is that because they're just because they're using smaller vehicles, or the increased patronage?
Yeah, through a variety. So it is expensive to run an empty fixed route traditional bus service that doesn't have many people in, and you may be able to use more flexible services, that DRT provides to increase cost efficiencies. And it's also worth saying that there's more flexibility in terms of time frames. So for drivers, they can maybe do a 2-hour slot when there's high peaks and things like that. So you're obviously not using as larger vehicles in a lot of cases as well. So there's a lot of flexibility that comes from it where the cost efficiencies can be found. The key thing we've found is that actually where there's schemes with kind of longer term horizons and there's commitment from the local authority, and also when there's continual learning in terms of the kind of cost efficiencies and scalability, that's when we start seeing real cost efficiencies and economies of scale coming in.
To add to that?
Yeah, I will add to it. I think from a community transport point of view, so I know kind of Max said that demand responsive transport's been around for a long time. We've been delivering it for over 60 years. So demand responsive transport in itself, in a principle of kind of one stop to many destination, many stops to one destination, has been around for a long, long time. The digital element is new. In terms of the cost effectiveness, so CT's learned over 60 years how we operate this at the lowest possible kind of cost. And it is about not having an empty bus sat kind of waiting and understanding your community. If you're trying to run a service 7 a.m. to 7 p.m, when you haven't got the demand from your community, it's going to cost a lot of money and you're going to have to put a lot of subsidy into it. But actually, if you're working with your community and understanding actually these are the peak points of time that we need this service. That's when we operate the demand responsive transport. At other points of the day we operate a slightly different service that is more responsive to our communities. That's how you can kind of make it sustainable, because I think there are some that are very expensive. There are some DRTs or digital DRTs that are very expensive. And then there are some that are making money, and it comes down to, have you got the passenger numbers, and do you understand your community and what your community needs? And if you haven't got either, yes, you're looking at £35 subsidy per person.
You stressed there that some of the digital DRT systems are expensive. And
Yeah.
You've got James sitting next to you. so is that because of the digital element, or is it just because they're too ambitious, or?
From a CT perspective, so I can talk to it from a CT perspective, we've not really at this point been able to make it work where it's cost effective for CT operators to have the kind of more expensive, newer type of technology, because we don't have the investments within our operators to be able to pay for it. So for us, yes, it's expensive. Our operators use around 17 different types of software, some of which have been built and developed by the sector for the sector, and they're the ones that are cost effective for us from a digital point of view.
Do you want to add to that, James?
Yeah, I think DRT can require levels of subsidy of a broad range, like Caroline has mentioned. I think often the way we work with our clients as well is also bringing back to what I said earlier about the flavours of DRT is, can we focus on getting journeys to a train station in the morning, then can we look to serve leisure trips throughout the portion of the day, and then back to serving commuters, and that way we're not just doing one type of service throughout the whole day, mixing it to make people's needs. And I think also some of the areas where we see sort of additional benefits, which are a little bit harder to quantify from a subsidy level, is around the sort of the social value metrics that relate to that. So our service in Hertfordshire, there were previously 4,000 people without access to public transport that now, through one of our services, do have access to public transport, and sort of that's a sort of a wider conurbation around 40,000 people that can see, within a certain amount of distance access. And so can we use that to help, think about the wider benefits that these systems have in place?
I think just also to add, you are dealing, to build on what James just said, you are dealing with rural areas where, if it was, they're more difficult areas to make commercially viable routes work. And one of the things that really DRT also can help support is something that kind of called commingling, in terms of using one DRT service for multiple different things. So there's examples where a DRT might be used for home to school transport during one point in the day, and during the other day will be used for DRT in terms of public transport. And obviously, if that was being done separately, two sets of vehicles, two sets of software, two sets of all that type of stuff, whereas doing it as one does provide also cost efficiencies.
Okay, and just finally, so quite a few of the examples you give in here, and this came through in the consultation, are around services which previously weren't viable, large amounts of subsidy, and what DRT's enabled is for the service to continue, still with a subsidy, but perhaps a lower level of subsidy. Is that its niche, rather than viable services in its own right? Is it just about maintaining these lifeline services at a lower cost? Is that its niche?
I would say that there are some schemes where they're making surplus and doing well, but I think that ultimately, I've used the example of subsidy per passenger. We should be looking at this more also about the benefit for social value and for economic value. The benefits really of DRT are being able to decarbonise and support people to get out of their private car onto a bus service, tackling things like social isolation, so getting people into town centres, and also the economy and the money that person would spend on the high street rather than, for example, staying at home. And there are different metrics that are being used to evaluate this, but I think DRT should be used to look, should be including those metrics as part of its value. That's really what it can enable, and I think we should be sort of, using those to show how it's successful rather than sort of just per passenger subsidy, really.
Thinking about the benefits rather than just the costs.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ollie?
Thank you, Chair. My Oxfordshire constituency of Didcot and Wantage is quite geographically diverse. We've got large towns which tend to have a pretty good bus service, villages with a few buses a day, but a couple of villages have only got one bus a week. So, as using that as an example, what gaps in connectivity do you feel community transport fills, and how do these gaps differ between rural and urban areas? Appreciate you've covered some of that, so perhaps just expand.
I mean, I can start. So, community transport operates on a mixed model. So there are very, very few community transport operators that just deliver dial-a-ride or just deliver a community bus or just deliver a volunteer car scheme. Most of them have a mixed model because of most communities have exactly the situation that you're talking about. So in that example, if you've got one public bus that runs once in the morning, once in the afternoon, you could have a community bus that fills a little bit of the gap so that residents feel secure in the fact that they can get home. So if they go out in the morning, they'll be able to get home because there is a community bus that subsidises that. Plus then you might have a dial-a-ride or a DRT service that kind of also runs alongside that is more flexible for people who cannot get to the bus stop. Because no matter how many times you have a bus running, if someone can't physically get to that bus stop, they can't use it. So you'd match that with a little bit of your dial-a-ride. You would then also look at, so for example, if it's 50 miles to get to your kind of mainstream hospital, if say if someone's receiving cancer care, that's often a specialist, it might be a good 30-mile journey, then actually that's where volunteer car schemes come into their own in terms of those single trips to support people to get to those places. So what you're looking at is a mixed model that enables everyone in the community to have access to transport that meets their needs. There isn't a single form of transport that is a panacea, that is going to go, well, if you put dial-a-ride in, everyone's going to be able to get there. If you put DRT in, everyone's going to get there. Because it doesn't work. You have to have that mixed model approach. And that's kind of what we suggest. And I think going back a little bit to the subsidy question, in a short answer, yeah, you do need that. You do need to be looking at what is it that the local place, and I'm not just talking about local authorities here, it's this, who subsidises that service could be a range of different organisations, but how that kind of subsidy is put into place. Lots of our organisations have an anchor income, so it's an income that enables those other things to happen. So it could be the anchor, for your example, is that community bus route and the concessionary fares that then helps to subsidise the dial-a-ride service. But you remove the community bus, you remove the dial-a-ride, they're all interlinked together financially, and that's really important to recognise in a place.
I think.
Could I, adding on to this sort of mixed model approach, I'm in London, so I don't know about school transport, but I know it's a statutory service in rural where children live a long distance from their nearest school. How much is school transport integrated into other systems in order to make best use of buses or drivers, or do local education authorities sort of live in a different world?
So where we see home-to-school contracts linked really well with that kind of broader bit is when you have the kind of either really good cross-departmental work within a local authority, or you have a staff member that's responsible for both. So, for example, we work closely with Suffolk. The lead staff member at Suffolk oversees home to school as well as community transport. So actually there's a really good connection between the two. And for lots of our members, the home to school contract is that anchor contract. So they do home to school start and end of the day, and that enables other things to happen. One of the things that doesn't happen as much around kind of mainstream home to school, so the kind of 9 to 16 seat minibuses, is we often don't have other passengers on those vehicles. That's the bit that could be, depending on if there's capacity in the vehicles, because we try to fill them. We don't want 4 seats empty. We don't want, we try to fill the vehicles. So if there is capacity, there could be a look to maybe take commuters or other things. But I think there's going to be a bit of a shift change in that, because there's lots around safeguarding that's kind of built into those contracts currently, which is why it doesn't really happen at the moment, but there's no reason it couldn't be looked at as a consideration to broadening out that kind of inter-school time.
So you said in Suffolk it works well. Are you saying that it depends? There's different cultures and different local authorities about whether they are flexible and engaged with other services, or whether they operate a completely segregated homeschool transport system?
Yeah, I mean, with every local authority, there's local authorities that do things really well, and there's local authorities that don't. You always have doesn't matter what the topic is, you always have that extreme. We're finding more and more that more local authorities are encouraging our members to do home to school, and that's primarily because they are cutting the discretionary grants that are going into community transport, and so they see that as a way for CT to enable to continue to fund the Dial-A-Ride. So I think that's being seen as a kind of anchor contract effectively from local authorities.
Okay, we'll come on to funding a bit later. Okay, mixed model approach. There are some sort of legislative complications with that. Steph.
Just before I get onto that, can I just come back to something which you said, Caroline? I'm interested in everyone else's views on this too. Steph Ackrow, MP for North Norfolk. Caroline said, you need all these different options. We can't have a system without different choices, which I totally accept. But doesn't the journey user, the transport user, need to feel like it's all part of one system? Otherwise, you're just phoning around, thinking around 20 different options in order to make one journey and having to be passed from one to the other to see if they can support your needs.
I mean, it would be great if that could happen. Absolutely. There is often a lot of our members, the demand they get is from word of mouth. So it's from a passenger telling somebody else, who then becomes a passenger, who then tells someone else, who becomes a passenger. It is quite hard to find the service that you need because, I don't know, we're going to talk about funding later, but because often what happens around some of the contracts is that they have limitations to them. So you can only take people for this journey, or you can only take this type of person, or you can only go here. Or if it's set up in response to a local need, they might have a geographical restriction, or so it is hard for passengers to navigate that and understand actually which service they need. But again, it's mainly led by local authorities, where there's a kind of central place where if you want community transport, you can go and have a look and try and find what it is you need. It would always be great if there was a central booking system and everyone went to one place. That's the kind of panacea. But in some places you've got 12, 13 community transport operators, you've got to get them all on board, you've got to bring them all in, as well as then all the commercial operators, and it's never not doable, but it is a challenge. It would be good to have
that. That's just amongst
that.
community transport operators. Of course, it's not looking at all the other non-private transport options.
So if I can add that, the mobility as a service is kind of what we're talking about here, which is having one system where you can look and see different transport options, public transport options, and choose which of them to use. We have a lot of our members who work in the space. There's a lot of partnerships that go on with local authorities in terms of some providers of software solutions for DRT also provide MAS products as well. I know Padam and Siemens also do that as have a MAS element that you work with as well. Mobility as a service. This is where you basically have an app that can show you different options, and you can choose which type of public transport to use. It's also worth saying there's the future transport zones, which were set up in 2020, I think, and it was basically £90 million for 4 regions across the UK, funded by government. So areas like Solent and West of England, and Transport for West Midlands being one. And they focused a lot on MAS as well, but included DRT within that. So there's different models there, but there is a focus on how you can use MAS and to support DRT services and give those people, give residents lots of options.
I think just on that mobility as a service point that Matt was mentioning, DRT in general, our goal is to support the wider transport ecosystem, is to enable people to travel to places to then make more multimodal journeys, whether that's by rail, whether that's by fixed line bus. It's kind of not thinking of it as an isolated form in itself, but how can people then go forward and make more journeys, or even by active travel. And if community transport is an enabler or the community transport operator is running a service which enables people to then get to a train station, then that's what we support.
Thank you. And I'm sure colleagues will have other questions to build on some of that. But back to what Chair was just encouraging me to move us on to. I think you've again touched on it, Caroline. This slightly labyrinthine legislative context. I mean, I've met one of my community transport operators, and I couldn't believe some of the permutations they told me about of this legislation. Are the Section 19 and 22 permit systems, I'm looking specifically at you, actually fit for purpose, or is that part of the problem?
So, I mean, if we think about it, the legislation that non-commercial operators, I'm going to use the term non-commercial because actually we have a number of different types of operators that use Section 19 and 22, including local authorities. So, non-commercial legislation is from 1985, and we've been tinkering around the edges. So the changes that have been made just tinker. So, short answer, no, it's not really fit for purpose. We are working with DfT and the Traffic Commissioner, and we have regular conversations to try and ensure that services can fit within the current legislation, but we're bending things to try and make them work. So our view is that there needs to be a kind of wholesale relook at non-commercial operations. So not what has happened in the past a little bit is we've looked at a mode of how can we get a flexible route. So we'll tweak something that then goes through legislation. It's not tested in law. No one really fully understands if they're operating within the boundaries. And so then everyone's a bit worried about it. And it's kind of, so yeah, it's that broader bit, because that would bring in consideration of DRT. It would bring in consideration of Section 19. We have a kind of quite a significant issue at the moment around small vehicles and community transport operators. So they are treated very differently to Section 19 minibuses, and we are in discussion with the Traffic Commissioner about whether those vehicles should be operating. So we've got a whole... It's complicated, but it's not entirely complicated because there are lots of things you can do. Whenever we try and work with a place, initially people come to us and they say, well, what can we do within a Section 19? And I kind of say, well, let's park that. What is it you want to do? So what is your community need and what services do you want? Let's plan that, and then we will find the right bits of the legislation that can enable that to happen. But what that needs is quite forward-thinking commissioners, often, if it's local authority funded, so that you can look at the service and go, oh, okay, because one of the challenges non-commercial has is something called incidental to profit. So we cannot in any way enable a commercial operator to make profit, which means we cannot subcontract to a commercial operator because we will then be helping them make profit. So things like non-emergency patient transport, for example, there's a big barrier there for a lot of our members when actually we could bring huge value, but we can't subcontract.
Does that extend to the issue of, or the opportunity of dropping people off at bus stops if you're actually putting passengers on a commercial service?
No, only if the commercial operator is paying the community transport operator. The issue is where the money is flowing. Yep. So yes, if first Stagecoach said, we'll give you X amount of money if you drop people off here, yes, then that would be incidental profit, and we couldn't do that.
Just going back to the limitations or otherwise of the legislation, I mean, for private hire, it's really simple. It's owned by district. The badge, the authority that gives you the badge is where you can collect from. Which dimension, if you were to sort of think about the full scope of the possibility for DRT, which dimension would be the most sensible to make the kind of restriction on operations? Would it be destination, origin, transport user, segment, journey type? What would be the sort of sensible way of actually separating the not-for-profit from the commercial sector?
You could use either 19 or 22 to deliver any of those connotations.
Yeah.
Currently.
But if you're going to make it more flexible, if you're going to rewrite the legislation, make it simpler and easier for operators to work within.
Now, so you're getting me on public saying, well, we don't have a specific view of what it could look like because we need to consult with members and stakeholders. The issue we have with Section 22 is the kind of level of flexible routes and kind of how flexible you can be and who can be on that vehicle, who can pre-book before they get on that vehicle, how many seats you're allowed to fill. So there's limitations in that. With Section 19, you can't take members of the public, so they have to be they have to be pre-booked. It has to be pre-booked effectively. So it's kind of looking at, we want non-commercial to be able to take public kind of take the public so that they can stop at stops, but we also want to be able to pre-book. So it's kind of whether you can do a merger of the 19 and 22. I know that there has been conversation around having an operator's license, so a bit like a PSV. So rather than having the two different permits that we have that then kind of like, how are we operating under this, are we operating under that, which one are we doing, but rather as a non-commercial operator, this is what you can deliver within it, and you don't have to consider 19 or 22. Obviously, if it was a fixed route, you'd still have to register it with the traffic commissioner, but it would be more flexible, and you wouldn't have to be trying to fit a service into one of the types of legislation.
Thank you.
So that's kind of, but I think it is worth looking at commercial operators versus commercial operators and non-commercial, and just simplifying the non-commercial side. I think that answers.
Thank you. Scott, recruitment.
That's you, Caroline, I'm afraid. So is another constraint you face driver recruitment?
We have significant issues around driver recruitment. There's a couple of reasons for that. The main one currently is the D1 driving licence requirement. So prior to 1st of January 1997, everybody had D101 on their driving licence, which meant you could drive for non-commercial operators, or you could volunteer where hire reward is taking place. So you could drive the 9 to 16 seat minibuses. It's 9 to 16 seats that we predominantly have the issue around driver recruitment. After 1997, we've just slowly been declining in terms of the number of people. Over the next 5 years, we're looking at a fifth of drivers kind of going, and we're also then looking at an ageing workforce as well, which is the challenge, because people, when they retire, when they get into their late 60s and 70s, do they want to be driving a 16-seater minibus around? We're trying to encourage them, lots of people do, but actually we've got that ageing population. We have been trying to influence government for a number of years to make a change to that legislation, the driving licence legislation. There was a kind of call for evidence a couple of years ago now, 2022, and overarchingly, our view of the results were that people were generally in favour of changing that legislation, but quite rightly with a training requirement, because you wouldn't want just me to get in a minibus and start driving it without any training. We don't want that. Operators must operate safely and legally. Really what we're asking for, because that call for evidence was looking at D1 as a whole, so that would influence commercial as well as non-commercial operation, and I know that threw up a lot more challenges around kind of training and those elements. What we're really asking for is a little bit of the status quo. So actually, I've got a B licence, why can't I drive for non-commercial? I got my licence 6 months after the change. So what's the difference between me and someone that was 6 months older than me in terms of being able to operate? I was with operators last week with one of them who's operating a Section 22, links 5 villages together. It's the only bus, and they are planning for closure over the next few years because they just cannot get the volunteer drivers. They're fully volunteer operated, and it's not always feasible to say, well, we'll just pay for training, because it can cost anywhere from £1,300 to £2,000 to get a driver through D1. Another operator we work with who's got 20 volunteer drivers, it's a huge cost. Their turnover isn't even, it'd be more than their turnover as an organisation. Yeah. It's just not feasible or practical, so we need legislation change in that regard. But we also have issue recruiting drivers and volunteers in general, because of a number of factors. We've got an ageing workforce, ageing kind of population. We haven't seen the comeback after COVID that everybody was expecting, so we had that big bump of volunteering, but actually then some people found they were going to do other things and haven't come back to volunteering. For our volunteer car schemes, cost of living has been a big kind of had a big impact. So volunteer car schemes are when a volunteer drives their own vehicle and they get paid the mileage, out-of-pocket expenses. And the mileage allowance, because that hasn't changed in 2010, wasn't it? So a long time, the 45p per mile.
Sorry, that is set by law. You can't. It's not flexible. It's not up to you to. No.
Yeah. So that's the issue that we've got. So because volunteers are kind of telling us that it's now costing them more. It's the 45p is putting volunteer drivers off driving. We particularly had an issue, obviously, when petrol and diesel prices spiked a couple of years ago. We have been making representation to Treasury to kind of say we think this needs to be looked at because we've got evidence from our members that the number of volunteer drivers is dropping. I mean, as an organisation, you can pay kind of whatever you want for the mileage, but there's tax implications for it. And that's the issue we find. If someone's volunteering, they don't want to then have to do a tax return on the kind of number of volunteer miles that they're doing. So it's just creating that huge barrier for us in terms of volunteer recruitment.
So I've actually got one of those P97 licences. I know I look much younger, but I do have one of them. And I did do some minibus driving when I was a lecturer, taking students to visits and things. I can't say I always enjoyed it, to be honest. It was quite a bit different from driving a car. But if I was to rock up at one of your members and volunteer to be a driver with my ancient driving licence, would they give me any kind of training just to make sure? Yes.
Yeah, they would. So we operate a national training programme called MIDAS, which is targeted at ensuring that minibus drivers are aware of the kind of requirements. So part of that training includes a driver assessment. So you will do basically a mini driving test with a qualified instructor to ensure that you know how to drive that vehicle, that you're driving that vehicle safely. There will also be training by the operator and through our MIDAS programme as well in terms of the policies and procedures that you have to follow. So, for example, everyone has to do a walk-around check. So we very much follow the roadworthiness guide from DVSA in terms of ensuring that drivers are trained effectively. So looking at those walk-around checks so drivers know, oh, that tyre looks a little bit bald, we need to pick that up, or I'm not going to take the vehicle out. They also get given training on other elements, so we're seeing more and more frail passengers, so things like dementia awareness training, those kind of bits, to ensure that people know what they're doing.
So I think my employer gave me that mini driving test, but that was a member of staff within the university that did that. Is that still the case? One of your own members would test the potential volunteer or employee to do through that test. So it's not an independent test, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
So there's no kind of national set training currently in place. Like there would be if you did D1 by test, you'd have to do your CPC training. So in our sector, there's no mandated training. So our MIDAS training, which we try and encourage and advocate for organisations to use, then it is an external trainer that would do that for you. But absolutely, we have a number of members who do deliver their own training programme. If anybody comes to us to apply to us for a permit, we look at the type of training that they provide to their drivers. And if we feel that the training isn't quite enough from what they tell us, then we would either give them their permit based on you have to put this in place, or we wouldn't give them the permit until we were assured that actually they are training their driver to a standard. What we are in the process of looking at with our MIDAS training is having an offer for very small operators, because there's a cost involved. You have to pay for this. And if you have 20, 30, 40 volunteers, £30 per volunteer still starts to add up. So we are looking at a more cost-effective training offer for our very small members.
Okay, one last small question. So if the DVLA doesn't change the licensing to go back to the kind of pre-97 setup, what kind of impact is that going to have on services over the next, was it 5 years you said? Yeah, 5 years for the 20% drop.
They'd reduce or stop.
Okay.
Quite simply, if we haven't got the drivers, if we don't, because it's not just the volunteer drivers, it's also paid drivers. A lot of our operators that use paid drivers still don't have a significant amount of money to spare, because often they're using that to maintain their vehicles or replace their vehicles. So we will see services reduce and we will see services stop if we aren't able to change that legislation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I go now to Catherine on accessibility, please?
Yes, just a couple of questions on accessibility. You've been talking about size of vehicle, but because many of the community transport and DRT vehicles fall below the size thresholds that trigger requirements for wheelchair access and audiovisual information on board, what support do those sectors need to make sure that services are fully accessible?
Well, if I start off, I think it's worth saying that DRT does help accessibility above and beyond looking at sort of the vehicles, because there's research from organisations like Transport for All that show 70% of disabled people have issues using pavements, and particularly in rural areas where there's grassy knolls and verges, that actually getting to a bus stop can be very difficult. So having a door-to-door service or a near door-to-door service can help accessibility anyway. There are a range, there's different DRT vehicles available. There's wheelchair accessible vehicles for the larger minibus vehicles, and also a lot of DRT technology providers do invest in the latest sort of guidelines on accessible bookings, and also in terms of the screen reader. So for people who are visually impaired, they can have the DRT website read out to them and booked via that.
Do you put that in place even when the vehicles are smaller and it's not
yes.
required?
And I think a lot of DRT providers do that anyway as part of it. It's worth saying there are ways of, on a lot of the apps, you can mark whether you have a disability or reduced mobility, and therefore the right vehicle can be sent to you. Obviously, there's a range of different schemes, but there's lots of those that are doing that type of thing.
Could I ask the same in relation to community transport as well?
Yeah, I mean, kind of accessibility is something that is just built into our service from the start, because predominantly the majority of our passengers are people that are older or people with a disability. So most of them have some sort of mobility issue or some sort of additional requirement that's needed. So 76% of our minibuses are accessible, and 83% of MPVs are accessible. And what we find is that some operators have been getting the smaller MPVs because, particularly for shorter journeys, that works for people who might need a wheelchair access with a couple of people in the vehicle with them. So I think the challenge for us around it is having the funds to replace vehicles when they get towards the end of their life. But by far the majority of minibuses are accessible. I was with a member the other day who was telling me that their lift had been used over 30,000 times. And I was in that vehicle at the time and seeing the lift used at least 4 times in that trip. So they do get used quite a lot. We also have, the other thing to kind of think about with accessibility, the vehicles is a big one. What we do within community transport is we often have passenger assistance as well. So we're not just relying on the driver to be able to do everything to support those passengers, but also there is a passenger assistant in the vehicle who is helping. And the way the trips are designed also are accessible. So we don't rush passengers to get on vehicles. So if if it takes somebody 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get on the bus, that will be factored in the journey time for it. So there isn't a kind of, CTR telling their drivers you've got a 3-minute turnaround time from picking up to kind of getting off. And that's the biggest part, I think. And if you ever go out and witness CT, that is the bit that I think will hit you the most, is the care that is taken for getting people on and off the vehicles, and the time that takes. And that's what makes it accessible for most of the passengers, because they feel safe on those vehicles. But also booking systems, all those kind of things, we have mixed models to ensure that kind of people use it. I think one of the advents of technology, though, is that there are some people that aren't confident using the phone, so an app can be an additional kind of bit for that. Only about 3% of our operators use apps quarter of them use online booking forms, but apps, it's a kind of lower number. It's partly due to us not being able to afford the technology, but online booking is kind of getting up there for those that don't want that kind of personal bit.
That does segue nicely into a question. I know that it was covered a little bit at the start, but in terms of looking at the accessibility of DRT services to people who are digitally excluded and or in areas with low mobile coverage, how do you respond to that? What is your experience of it, and how can it be overcome, improved?
Yeah, so I think by very nature the schemes that DRT is working with at the moment were funded by the Bus Service Improvement Plan or the Rural Mobility Fund, which in this nature is rural and therefore connectivity and diversity can be heightened. We offer as a software product, there is the option to book via the app and also via a website or a call centre. The call centre is usually handled by the local authority itself that's running the service, or the operator that is procured to run that service and run the vehicles. We see in the UK around 80 to 82% of bookings actually being made through the mobile app, so the digital uptake is quite high. It's then around 5 to 8% of bookings through a website, and that's where someone has some level of technology, to touch on what Caroline was saying, and then the remaining sort of 10% or so is done through the call centre. And I think with the call centre, it's often a small cohort of repeat users who ring up every week to make their bookings, or 2 or 3 bookings for the week to go to the shops, etc. And I think we understand the need and importance of a call centre and our interfaces to support that, because it is digital inclusion in places where sometimes inclusion could be an issue, and also that this might be the only journey that those people make in a week. And similarly, when we engage that, what we provide as a sort of a toolkit to the users is similar to what Caroline was saying. For ambulance users, we allow them to walk to virtual stops for their bookings, and they're allowed a set time by default for being picked up to board and alight the vehicle. For users with more specific mobility needs, we can allow them to be picked up from their door and dropped off right at the door of their destination. And we can allow the operators or local authorities to say, well, actually, that person needs 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And again, that's all counted for with the journey that they're taking.
Can I just, sorry, there's something I meant to say before. So the bit around accessibility, or a kind of future challenge we need to think about, is electric vehicles. Currently about 3% of our fleet is electric, but most of those are MPVs. The challenge, or the consideration we need to think about, is electric minibuses. And I say this because there's a couple of bits. The batteries are very, very heavy, and so they either take up the payload, which means potentially a 16-seater electric minibus actually can only take about 12 people because the battery is so heavy. So we have that issue, that it either takes up the payload and reduces passengers, or that actually it will push it over the weight threshold for a volunteer to drive. So currently volunteers on a B licence, which about half our members use volunteers on a B licence, if the vehicle is less than 3.5 tonnes, or 4.25 if it's got a lift, but a battery can add up to 1,000 kilograms, so it can take it over that 3.5 tonnes, which means that then we can't use that vehicle. So there's those kind of bits around it. It also can, depending on where the battery is, it can reduce the ceiling height of the vehicle, which can make it harder for people to use. So it's just kind of thinking about, EV's great, we love EV, we would like more EV. We would like, as long as the range on it is appropriate, but there are accessibility factors to consider.
Mm-hmm. And another driving licence restriction, which we also need to look at as well. Steph, did you want to come in on something?
So I did nearly fall off my chair with the usage stats on mobile applications, and just before I ask this potentially divisive question, I'm not trying to kick the panel into confrontation deliberately. I spend a lot of my time arguing for the need for digital inclusion. I represent the oldest constituency in the country. I would say that at worst, the true nature of accessibility and digital exclusion is around 50% of my constituency, at the very worst. So that gap between 25% of mobile operators only offering mobile booking options doesn't surprise me that only 3% of journeys through DRT are booked, or community transport rather, are booked via mobile application. Doesn't that suggest that the operators could be doing more to make that option available to the willing members of their audiences?
So from a community transport side, there's two reasons why the tech, or two main reasons why the tech hasn't kind of gone out to everywhere. One is cost. In that it is quite costly to just to replace your IT system in any way. It is expensive. Never mind then if you've got an ongoing cost with it. So that is the other bit. The other thing to factor and think about is the size of the operators and the capacity within the operators to take on board new tech and use new tech without support. They're all very capable individuals, but kind of the majority of our members have a turnover of less than £25,000 a year. And 60% of our members have a turnover of less than £250,000 a year. So you're not talking about operators that have got all this money to kind of play with, to test and pilot and have a marketing team at the back office to do all of these things. Operators want to use technology. They want it to help them to improve their service and to kind of manage some of the bookings. But then also our members talk to us about keeping that human element of journey planning. I know that we're moving to the tech to be able to negotiate with passengers about pick up and drop off, but actually if you're talking about kind of a person who's 80 years old and is trying to use that app, they're not going to negotiate with that. They're just going to be like, oh, it's not going to work. So we need to keep that personal ability to negotiate and journey plan.
James, do you meet buyer resistance in this regard, or you wouldn't insist on selling a whole separate scheme to every single minibus operator, would you?
No, so actually we work with Hampshire County Council at the moment. We've digitalised their community transport offering. So
across all of them?
So they are part of the Solent Future Transport Zone that Max mentioned earlier, and Hampshire have done their CT, and the discussion we're having with their CT is around, we're not going to say, in 12 months, are you going to have 80%? Is working with them to explain the digital benefits for some of their users, or indeed perhaps the carer or the guardian and son, daughter of someone who's in their 80s, perhaps making the journeys on their behalf and then receiving updates that mum or dad was booked, and we sort of layer that in as well. But I think working with CT is kind of, that's the level that we've worked at so far, is a sort of an umbrella authority rather than the individual operators themselves.
Okay, so that helps the cost issue potentially, but I think what Caroline is saying is that the outfit itself, you haven't really got the bandwidth if you're running a £25,000 turnover organisation to think about what sort of coffee you're buying, let alone whether you're buying new tech and implementing it. So has that extended down into actually directly supporting the operators in the embedding of that technology, or is it just about sort of commissioning so they don't have to pay for it?
No, we do very much work, right in the heart with them to understand what's the best approach for them to that. And some of them, their approach might just be a booking website that's a little bit more intuitive and not a call centre might only be 9 a.m. to 5 p.m, but if a booking website's open round the clock, then that can help. We recognise that having a mobile app booking system is not for everyone. We don't always find the need with community transport operators to do that. I think also sometimes we have the discussion with them about the membership of their services, similar to what Caroline was saying earlier, and I think sometimes their membership might be, have a certain mobility need or over a certain age, and sometimes they have the discussions with us around people thinking it's either or, not, both, and that sort of thing. And there could be someone in, their early 30s with a mobility need that could be using a booking website and have that flexibility and independence.
Absolutely. Some of the best accessibility assistive technology is inherently digital because it gives people every single option they might need to go through and check and double check and all those different permutations. So that's really interesting. I don't want to take this, of course. I'm just interested in whether Max has anything to add to this.
The only thing I would say to add is I don't think we might be slightly going down the road where it looks like the technology is prohibitive cost. As part of county-wide DRT schemes, technology is often quite a small cost, but it's worth saying that when you're dealing with the levels that community transport is, the 25k, that is understandable. And I mean, James has just given a great example of where there's collaboration in terms of a local authority working together or bringing things together. I would say that that's a common trend across all DRT, that the more there's scalability, the more that there's kind of local authorities working together, I think that you get sort of economies of scale, basically.
Do you want to come back in, just because I think the other thing to kind of think about with this is that some of the technology, and I'm not necessarily always talking about Padam here, so just to be clear, but some of the technology is built for DRT.
Yeah.
And actually, as I've mentioned, a CT operator has a whole range of services. So things like volunteer car schemes, they're not built for. Things like group hire, it's not built for. So we have operators who are kind of, yes, we've got a number of operators who are part of contracts with the council who are getting access to this technology, but it's only covering the part of the service that is funded by the council in some cases. Yeah. Whereas actually what we need as a sector is a tech offer that covers all those different modes. So that organisation needs one piece of software that can manage volunteer car schemes, group hire, DRT, kind of non-emergency patient, that can cover all of those different types of bookings that are coming into them. And if we had that, then that's something that we could, operators would kind of look towards. As I say, 17 different pieces of software currently in the sector.
And regardless of the number of bits of software, presumably there is no data standard for journey booking. There's no, in the way that there is, for example, for rail ticketing, but there presumably isn't a BSI standard for all the data that goes into a transport booking.
No.
Right, thank you.
I mean, I'm guessing that your members include a large number of them, quite long-standing local, very small charities, maybe at best with one paid staff member, and hugely vulnerable to local authority cutbacks from their voluntary sector budget, and even some, I know, going under. So, I can see why the trying to sort of keep up with the opportunities of new technology is in the very local third sector, which is where many of your members are, is probably easier said than done in a lot of cases. So, I guess that is that a fair summary of the community transport sector?
I mean, it is. We do have large
operators.
A lot of them. Yeah, I mean, we do have some very large. We do have. I mean, when we say large operators, we're talking about kind of vehicles, fleet sizes of kind of 25 to. I think our largest is Ealing Community Transport, which is about 150 vehicles. But that is the biggest. Most of our operators have about 5 vehicles. That's the kind of size, and a lot of them are being run entirely on volunteers.
Okay, thank you. Right, let me just find my place again. Right, I think, Ollie, you're next.
Thank you, Chair.
Improving connectivity.
Yes, the new Labour government has an aspiration to develop an integrated transport strategy. In that context, can you explain the role both community transport and demand responsive transport could potentially play as first mile and last mile solutions? Perhaps, start with Max.
Yeah, sure. So, we've been working to feed in our members' views into the Integrated National Transport Strategy. It's fair to say we think DRT will play a very important role in that, and we've talked about some of the ways that DRT can act as a feeder into the transport network that can support particularly rural mobility, and be part of sort of the transport offer that local authorities and transport authorities can provide to their residents. So we would certainly suggest it's worth including in that. I think it's just worth taking sort of maybe a step back and saying about sort of transport technology as a whole. There's a huge amount that can be done in terms of supporting the INTS through the data that's being provided through not just DRT services but across the transport network. And we also need to think a bit more about what I'd say is sort of transport as a whole, in the sense that congestion is one of the things that will impact DRT services as it will all road transport. And we would say the INTS, if it's going to achieve its goal, needs to look at these things holistically and work out how you can resolve them as kind of with working with local authorities. And whilst we're on just the point about congestion, one of the things we saw that the DfT included in their submission to this inquiry was that congestion is a real concern for all bus services. We were quite shocked that they cancelled a fund for AI and new technology in terms of traffic management, which would have helped solve congestion and could have been used for things like bus management, bus prioritisation. The fund was called the Intelligent Traffic Management Fund. It was about 20 million to test different new ways of kind of using traffic management technology. I would say that type of thing, we should be thinking holistically about it as part of INTS and not just sort of looking at these different elements in silos.
Yeah, I think for DRT as the role, the way we see things is it's kind of a cog in the wheel of the transport ecosystem. It's got to fit in. It's not the solution to everything. It's about how can we get people to those first and last mile that you reference. And I think it's then about thinking what's best for the DRT in that area. Where's the connectivity hub, in essence? So for our service we have in Cheshire and Cheshire West, we've redesigned parts of the service and have portions of the fleet, meeting the train station departures to Liverpool and beyond at certain times of the day, particularly the morning and afternoon peaks. I think, through, to touch on the data point earlier, through better data standards for DRT and bus integration, we can then say to a user booking a journey, okay, well actually, the number one bus is doing this same route at the same time, and we can push you towards that journey. Or we can indeed say, okay, well, if you want to make the connection, and it's kind of similar to their mobility as a service, providing that option to say, okay, well, if you get the DRT journey at 10, the bus at past, you'll make your 11 a.m. train.
I agree pretty much with kind of what's been said. CT does do those links already to kind of rail where it is. I think from the integrated transport strategy point of view, some of the things that we've been pushing are around that kind of greater awareness of all CT services. So often when local transport authorities are planning some of these and thinking about it, they only know about the services they commission and not the services they don't. And quite a large provision of what we deliver isn't necessarily commissioned or funded by councils. So it's understanding the whole offer, and actually there might be a service going to the train station that the council don't know anything about, so they're assuming that there's no service there because they don't fund it, so we don't tell them about it, because they don't ask us and they don't involve us. So there's that element to be considered, and that falls through even in little things, things like, so for example, road closures. So we've had examples of our members, it seems to happen a bit more in the north, because there might be a community bus route, or there's a dial-a-ride service that is using virtual stops in terms of picking people up that are pre-booked. Council doesn't know about it, and they close roads, and then they cut off whole villages from these services. So we've seen this. In fact, we had a call into our advice service this week around what can a member do when the council's closed a road and it impacts their service and the council doesn't know about it. So that would then change the whole first last mile kind of element and accessibility for those people. So it's very much thinking about more than just what is statutorily funded and what is wider funded, and how can we bring that into the whole consideration of first and last mile.
So linked to that is my next question, actually. Do you sometimes find that where there are boundaries between local authorities, and a lot of the funding is very much done along local authority lines, do you find there are issues with coordinating transport options across those local authority boundaries?
So I would say kind of the principle is that where there's a will, there's a way with local authority boundaries, which is that a lot of local authorities do work together. And what you can sometimes see is, so in the case of Wales, they run Flexi 1 DRT service for the whole country. You see some that have a DRT service that crosses boundaries, and that the local authority might either work with the local authority next to it, or may just decide that actually for the benefit of the residents in its area, that it doesn't mind dropping people off over a pretty artificial boundary. And I think that's what we would really incentivise and suggest, is that actually we look at this as journeys for passengers who are using the service, not by invisible boundaries. And also it would be worth saying that you do have some local authorities that are using call centres jointly, so have one call centre for multiple services, for example. So there is a lot of co-working together, but we'd certainly promote more of that.
Anything to add?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I think from us, just like Max said, a bit more promotion around. Yes, the funding has been awarded to local authority X or Y, but if there could be a bit of flexibility to cross some boundaries. A couple of examples that we have within our client base. So we have a service in Hertfordshire that runs as far as Bishop Stortford, and then there's that invisible boundary that Max mentioned for Stansted Airport. Similarly in Surrey, there's Gatwick Airport. And also, it's not just airports; it's other local services in Gloucestershire. The boundary between I guess it's a national boundary between England and Wales, where people go across the national boundary to access school or employment or leisure journeys. I think the beauty of the digital DRT options is we are collecting all this data around where people want to travel, when they want to travel, and we can feed that in, so we know that there are people looking to travel to these places just across the border. So if sort of wider promotion around how cross-boundary services could work, then we'd really, really look forward to seeing that.
So nearly half our members in rural areas cover multiple boundaries. So it is happening. In most cases, when it's happening, they have to negotiate with the different councils. And again, as I was saying about kind of the connectivity of funding, if one council reduces, it can have a knock-on for the other council. So there could be greater cross-boundary working and a better use of investment across those, and also factoring in other parts of the system like parish councils as well, which are kind of starting to move into this space, as with Eastleigh, who are kind of, I know, talking to you guys. So parish councils are moving into this space, and they could definitely be a bigger part of that picture across boundaries in terms of connecting up those very rural villages. I think it's kind of thinking about even within, so if you've got a shire county and the districts within, because the district boundaries would still be seen as boundaries. And we've sometimes seen where a county council is delivering a service that is also then part funded by all the districts, and there isn't always communication between the districts and the county. So a district will make a decision on a service that then will have a knock-on impact on all of the others. But devolution and some of those. This is the big thing around devolution, and actually the kind of challenges it's going to throw, where we've got much bigger cross boundaries, and we know that local authorities are having conversations with our members about, well, how will this look when we go from just one shire county to 2-3 shire counties coming together, and how are we going to work together without losing some of those kind of smaller scale accessible services.
Okay, thank you. Right, on to the buses bill. Alex.
There's no mention of DRT and very little mention of community transport in the government's buses bill. What do you think that the government's view is of the role of these types of services?
So there was a mention in the debate by Minister Hendy that the bill was basically allowed DRT to carry on as it would currently, and I think we would take that view that the bill is kind of DRT neutral. It allows local authorities to have the choice to do what they would want to do. And one of the things that I think is a bigger issue in some ways, because ultimately it's good that local authorities have the choice and have the ability to decide what services they provide, but we would certainly want more of a look at things like the regulations around DRT, so around VAT for private hire vehicles versus public.
We're coming to
that. I'm sure you will, yes. but I think those are more prescient for us than in terms of sort of what needs to be resolved. And the bill, as I say, is kind of neutral and puts the onus on the local authorities.
Yeah, I'd probably agree there with what Max said, as it's neutral. If it's giving the flexibility to the authority and we can enable them to improve their transport plan for users, then that's where we come in.
So the majority of the bus bill, CT is exempt, so Section 19 and 22 services are exempt, so we're exempt from franchising, we're exempt from a number of areas. So we have been talking with DFT around this. There's pluses and minuses to that exemption. I think that we didn't challenge it or haven't challenged it because actually quite a lot of our services aren't funded by local authorities, so we don't really want to have to ask their permission if they go down the franchising route to continue to operate those services. But the biggest challenge for us is that then it means we're not it's not a duty for us to be round the table. So for us, the key is around the statutory guidance that's going to follow the bus bill and the inclusion of CT as a consultee and the kind of requests that come with that. So we're really keen for, within some of these, that there are kind of alliances developed that can feed in. So whether that's a CT alliance or an accessible transport alliance that would enable those franchised areas to consider and understand community transport and also the enhanced partnerships. There's a couple of areas in the bill which are one that is a little bit concerning to us, which is around the kind of BSOG, so the local funding ability, which will give councils, the local transport authorities, the power to take that from DFT to manage. And as we've talked about, there are great local authorities that I'd be really excited about if they had that power, and then there's some where I'd be like, oh, hang on a minute, we could have the potential that we could lose that money. So for us, it's about making sure it'd be ring-fenced and protected, and that it couldn't then just be used to fund something else. And the kind of local measures element within the bill, I think it's important for us to understand what socially necessary services actually are. So I think that's going to come in the in some of the guidance around what that is. We would like to see CT kind of included within that, particularly within those realms, so that we are protecting those anchor contracts and that anchor income for CT within those models. So we're not specifically mentioned within there, because in lots of places we are exempt. Some places we're not, so like the new electric vehicles, if we did operate over a 22-seater, which some of our members do operate over 22-seaters, they would be kind of fall within those requirements. But yeah, it's generally fairly neutral, kind of like DRT, but some bits for us. It's the statutory guidance and the ongoing conversation around that guidance that is really, really important for us.
Okay. Building on that, for example, Greater Manchester, in their first tranche of B network, there was no mention at all, they did not include DRT in that first phase. And if you look at the business cases for other potential franchised areas, again, there doesn't seem to be very much mention of DRT. Why do you think that that's happening, given that we appear to be moving into a world where there's going to be more franchise services? And then, Caroline, obviously you've also mentioned that enhanced partnerships, which many places will continue to have. To what extent are community transport providers and other DRT part of things like EP panels?
So, I mean, just on the example for Greater Manchester, I do think they run DRT in terms of some of their, I think maybe school services, but I'd need to check that. I don't want to sort of confirm. So I can certainly come back to you on that. And I mean, just more on the general point, I think it's for local authorities to have a look at what services they want to provide. What the Rural Mobility Fund did do, which was very positive, which was it kind of almost acted as a bit of a seeder to say to some local authorities, you could try DRT, and a lot of them have now progressed, and a lot of the schemes are moving successfully from that fund as well. So, I think there is a thing here with local authorities maybe not having tried it before, having maybe a bit of nervousness at the start about it, but things like the Rural Mobility Fund have certainly helped with that, and we would certainly suggest to local authorities to look at their area and see how DRT can help support them, and I think a lot would benefit from it.
Yeah, I think it's much more around plugging the gap and reviewing, the current status of the network, and we've certainly worked with authorities where, commercial operators maybe have withdrawn services or services changed, shortened, and that's where DRT is then plugging those gaps in and thinking about it. I think it's going to become more of a mainstream thinking, and that's certainly what we fear, but it's, where's the best place to put it, and actually looking at your arterial network and seeing how that operates for a bit, and then working out where to put the rest of it is how the connectivity works.
Did you want to carry on, Caroline?
Yeah. So, from a Greater Manchester point of view, so they do have a dial-a-ride service. They haven't included that within their kind of model. They're just starting to think about it now. So it is going to get thought about, but it's kind of a bit later down the line. Cambridge and Peterborough have just completed their consultation around their franchising, so they are kind of committed through that, or had a recommendation through that they will look to involve their CT within their franchise design. So we're seeing people or local authorities starting to think about how they would include those. In terms of CT involvement in enhanced partnerships, we've got some really great examples where there have been kind of models set up where CT feeds directly into EPs and that there is a CT representation on the board. And then we've seen areas where actually they sit a bit outside of it. I think that there's kind of differences like Shropshire, West Midlands, so West Midlands Combined Authority and Shropshire, there's two really good examples where they have a CT alliance that kind of meets with support from the local authorities, and then there's a kind of full feed of information up and down. West Midlands are really supportive through the funding through that enhanced partnership out to the sector as well. There's other examples across the country where they are engaged. Section 22 operators are often pulled in straight to those enhanced partnerships, but Section 19 is that discretionary bit. But we are starting to see more of a movement to those operators being considered and kind of pulled into those groups.
So now looking at funding, so we've had mention before of BSIP and BSOG. So thinking about funding that was kind of basically created with the thought of fixed routes, normal timetable bus services, but which have also been used for DRT. How do you think those funding streams, how effective have those funding streams been in supporting the growth of DRT?
Well, I think there's a lot of schemes that are using BSIP and BSOG funding, and a lot of local authorities that have used that funding. I think for us, the big thing is having long-term viability. Some of the things we mentioned on the panel today is really about tailoring schemes, starting off with a DRT scheme and then tweaking it to based on a community's sort of needs. And that obviously doesn't happen overnight. That needs long-term certainty. So, there was the £955 million announcement for BSIP mentioned a few months ago. But what we would like to see, and where we think that you could start seeing cost efficiencies and more effective DRT schemes, is longer-term funding, where a local authority knows that they have a kind of a ring-fenced fund for that service and are able to play around with the scheme to make sure it suits the needs of residents.
I think from us, we really welcome the idea that the latest round of funding was non-competitive and it was spread across all local authorities, which if some of them wanted to use that for DRT, then they could, and previously maybe they perhaps couldn't. I think it's all about, like Max said, the greater adoption and greater possibility for the residents. And some of the schemes that we operate that were funded by the Rural Mobility Fund, although that fund has kind of run its course and expired, actually they're using other modes of transport funding, in this siloed model. They're sort of cross-siloing and funding a bit of school transport during the mornings, and then using other modes, but that's a bit of BSIP and such as Section 106, for example. So I think going forward, that funding model, if we could see some more long-term funding, that also enables us to work with our local authority partners on what DRT is, what it means for the residents, that education piece, and then look at that modal shift piece and how can we support other modes of travel and connectivity through DRT.
I mean, so that from a CT perspective around BSIP funding, we've seen quite a mixed approach and the usage of it, and I think that primarily came from confusion from DFT guidance. So because DFT guidance is often, I recognise that they want to kind of keep it a little bit broad so that they're not kind of totally black and white for local authorities to give some choice. But what it means then is sometimes people don't know exactly, can we use the money for this purpose or not. So because it didn't explicitly say, yes, you can fund Section 19 services, there was a lot of debate back and to for a while about whether it could fund those services. And that's also linked to that definition of open to the public. It's a definition I always hate when DfT say this funding is for those open to the public, because CT is open to the public. There might be an element of a criteria, but it's still open to the public. But that we had a number of conversations with areas who were saying we want to support CT, but we can't use our BSIP, we're not allowed. So we would then, with that, negotiate with DfT, and DfT would come back and say, oh yes, you can. And so we saw actually some really great grant schemes coming out of that funded vehicles. That's also funded things like group hire services, and really tried to look in different ways. So there's a number of examples where it's worked really well when the local transport authority has gone, oh yeah, it can fund this, and let's look a little bit differently and let's pull people in. But then we've got about half the BSIPs that didn't even mention CT or include CT. So that's the kind of differences around those.
And then just on concessionary passes, do you think that they should be accepted as standard on DRT and community transport services, and what would the impact of that be?
I think from the schemes that we work with, it's the local authorities, and sometimes it's their discretion. Some of the services we run, they're accepted throughout the whole operational day, sometimes they're only after 9:30, and some indeed are free, some of them are just a flat rate discount. I think we still encourage people to take patronage, and if, by taking public transport instead of taking at the most like a private car, then we're still enabling modal shift. I think that's ultimately, thinking about the integrated national transport strategy, that's a good thing for the transport ecosystem.
I'd agree with that.
Okay, right. Katie.
Thank you, Chair. We're just speaking about longer term funding. What specifically might that look like? What are the best examples, if there are any, of current schemes that have really cracked that?
So, in terms of schemes that have cracked that, where we've seen local authorities, provide dedicated funding through DRT for a long period of time. So I think Milton Keynes, for example, set up their scheme a little while ago and have had a good, have had enough time to sort of tailor the scheme and work with it, and provided the dedicated funding to it. There's different ways to crack this, but I think ultimately, if there's long-term funding for the bus sector, that will support DRT. And, the Rural Mobility Fund was very useful in terms of introducing a lot of local authorities to DRT. BSIP is now being used for that. But I think actually, having a longer-term fund over 3 to 4 years, and internationally, what we see is a lot of countries where DRT is working successfully, I think have that longer funding horizon that allows them to develop schemes further.
Yeah. And so in areas like the one that I represent, which is a patch of the Kentish countryside, it's very rural, demand responsive transport really feels like it could be the answer, where you have so many people looking to get from smaller villages to larger villages for GP appointments and things like that. But I sent a survey to every home in my constituency and asked them about Kent Carrier, which is Kent County Council's flexible transport service, and almost nobody had heard of it. And I'm worried that there's a sort of negative feedback loop then. So nobody uses the service because they don't know that it exists, and then the conclusion that people take from that is that people don't want it, and then the funding gets pulled, and you still have all of these people who can't get around. I know you were talking earlier, Ms. Whitney, about word of mouth, but that's quite hard to get going. How do you spread the word about these services? Has anybody done that really well?
So we've seen examples from some of our members in terms of very clever things like going into a community centre or library and talking to residents there and trying to actively go into the community, work with councillors, work with local authorities to promote schemes. I'd probably sound like a broken record, but again, the long-term nature of these, if a scheme is only for a year or two, then it's understandable that you're not going to get the word out in time to fully utilise that service. But I think there are also lessons as well in terms of focusing on the marketing side of these things and making sure you've got enough attention in that to get the interest in the service.
I think when we've worked with the local authorities, sort of on-the-ground presence that they've done is the one that's really had the most impact. They've taken, if I think, a number of authorities we work with, once a month or once a quarter, they take a vehicle to market day and they have the vehicle there. They show people what it is. They give them an introduction. You can ring the call centre. You can book via other methods as well. And then it's kind of showing them physically what is there, and then talking to them more broadly about the concept of DRT, like we touched on earlier, a bit like a bus, shared journey, the journey time sort of improvements. And similar to what Max said around the funding method, I think if it's advertised as a pilot, then the incentivisation or the uptake of a user or a resident, for example, in your constituency, it might be there, but it might not. Whereas if it's,
you're not going to build a routine around it.
Exactly. Here's a service that, will be here for 3 to 5 years, and we can start to engage and learn. And I think one of the beautiful things about DRT is the flexibility of it means if we want to change bus stops, if we want to change destinations, we can do that really easily, and we're not bound by sort of the 56-day rules and permutations that you have with traditional bus services. To the point that thinking about the accessibility point we were talking about earlier, if we have virtual stops that maybe aren't quite right for someone in a wheelchair, but 50 yards either side up and down that road there is a drop curb, we can make that change and sort of then enable the service to grow and benefit the users. And it's kind of the way we see things working with authorities is during the lifetime of our contract with them is the service actually looks very different from day 1, year 1 to day 1, year 5. But the customer doesn't really notice the huge differences. They just see a much smoother service benefiting what they want to do.
I think for us, we would follow on that investment needs to be multi-year and a kind of in place. A lot of our operators, unless it's a contract that's let for 3 years, it's year by year. And so I think we would kind of, in terms of investment for CT, it needs to be kind of multi-stakeholder considered and included. So we would like to see it be strategy-led, the investment, so that it's not, here's just a grant scheme, go out and kind of do, a little bit like the Rural Mobility Fund, which was great, but here's a scheme that's kind of appeared a little bit out of nowhere, we're going to give some money, it's not really thought through, it's not part of a longer thought-out strategy that involved the stakeholders and the people actually delivering this and the people actually using it. And it needs to kind of factor in, as I've mentioned, the different types of operators and the different modes of transport. So just to give an example, we've got Motability funding that's come out. It's great. Motability is the only purpose, kind of CT purpose funding that's available. They've paused at the moment. But the operators have to have a turnover of over 150,000 to bid into it. So when small operators are coming in, they're having to get a kind of lead bidder and come in as a collective. So it's kind of, let's accept that there are some small operators. We see it, particularly in rural areas. They might have a Section 22 and a group hire. They're small, they want to stay small. Let's keep them. Let's ensure they are here in 20 years' time. We've got these slightly larger operators that are like, yeah, if you give us 5 more buses, we'll go out and we'll deliver, hundreds more journeys every day. If you give us that investment, we will do more. And kind of everything in between in terms of looking at those. I think the other thing for us is around, it is because we have a mixed funding model. So most operators have at least 5 different funding streams. So if we have a strategy and it's around funding, how can the government help pull in all relevant stakeholders? So Department for Health, Department for Health and Social Care, Department for Education, how are we bringing people together so it's not just here's, and I feel bad sometimes when I go to my contact at DFT going, I need money, and then DFT's like, well, I've got no money. And I'm like, I know you might not have any money, but these guys have got money, and they've got money, and they've got money. Why can't you pull all of them in? And including national funders. So my team did a bit of research around the National Lottery. They've never had a transport-specific fund. And the millions that they give out every year to charities, and often what happens from our point of view is that funding is given out, and so it could be a young people's service that's doing all these activities, and they don't really fund how those kids are going to get from their house to there. They'll just assume that it's going to happen. And sometimes what happens is those projects get funded and then they come to the CT operator and go, we need to get these people here. And we're like, well, we're doing our school run from this time to this time. If you started your class an hour later, we'd have been fine. So it's how we can kind of pull stakeholders in so that we've got a long-term, sustainable, mixed funding so that if something happens and kind of DFT pull, the raw mobility is not good, I don't know if it's going to get approved, but if that doesn't get increased, that we've still got other funders in that mix. And that then means you've got a sustainable, non-commercial offer that includes DRT and other modes that we're not scrabbling every 12 months to go, who's going to fund this? Or that's kind of what needs to happen. That's our kind of panacea a little bit. And it's not impossible. it would be a bit of work, but it is not impossible. It's not out of the realms. We just need to all come together collectively.
Done. Okay. Steph.
Thank you. Yes, building on this, I suppose just more broadly in the context of local government and financial pressures, is that impacting on community transport? Is it sustainable in the current way things are happening? Should central government actually play a greater role?
So I think the BSIP funding is ring fence, so that there is support that has helped support. There's been support through local authorities for bus services through that. What I would say about the wider financial issues with local authorities is that it is impacting the transport technology sector as a whole. We get a lot of feedback from our members that, particularly trying to sell into local authorities software as a service products. So, in the same way that a lot of the economy now uses software as a service to help deliver what they're doing, the local authorities often find it hard to get the operational expenditure to be able to fund those, even though they can maybe find capital expenditure for that. And that divide seems to provide a bit of a problem in terms of getting software as a service. And we see that in terms of even things like road safety technology that actually might be able to help with cost efficiencies in the long run, but getting it certified as operational expenditure and being funded is really difficult.
That's interesting. So that's quite specific to software and immensely frustrating for a number of different reasons, but stepping back again to the sort of wider picture of local authority funding sustainability for community transport?
I think just on the way we work with things, we do still have the CapEx and OpEx things, but often we are then looking with the authority and working with them to sort of interwork services, because there are some statutory services that are required, and if they can, like Caroline mentioned, if you need to be at school at a certain time, there is still some challenge around everyone wants to be somewhere for 8:30 or 9 a.m. in the morning and then leave at between 4 and 5. But how can we work with that flexibility if it means pooling funds and crossing those different silos of patient transport, education, and we have some really good examples where we are being able to do that. And I think when we're talking earlier about how that's set in local government departments, it's sometimes whether the person who oversees education sits in sort of a children's services department or within sort of a transport department, and that cross collaboration that can really then provide more benefit to those.
So 62% of our members receive local authority funding. It is the backbone of community transport. So when local authority goes down, we go down kind of with them effectively. We're so intrinsically linked together. What typically happens if local authority funding goes, we might see a CT close, or the service would just be dramatically reduced and changed. I think one of our challenges is that sometimes CT is funded from completely different departments. So you wouldn't also, you might assume that CT is funded by transport department, but it might be the communities department. It could be the adult social care department. It could be public health. They could be funded from a whole different range of places. And there's a huge challenge then for us in terms of negotiating with all of those different departments. So better cross-departmental kind of work would be good. I don't have the solution to local authority funding, but I reckon councils haven't had any money. I came into the voluntary sector in 2010. Councils had no money in 2010, and they've still got no money, and we're 15 years later. So they're never going to have any money. It's kind of actually, how are we making the informed and evidence-based decisions? And it goes back to our earlier conversation that it's not about the decision shouldn't be on the level of subsidy. One thing that's been, even though for us as a sector it's a little bit frustrating that DRT is seen as something different, it has actually brought out into the forefront our services and the fact that they need to be subsidised. So often local authorities would see the dial-a-ride as, here's a really nice luxury, we don't really quite get the value of it, we don't really quite understand it, so actually we might stop funding that. Now they're starting to deliver their own DRT or fund their own DRT, they're going, this isn't gonna make us money, this is gonna still cost us money. So it's helping because we're having more conversations with local authorities about how do we evidence the social value of this, so that we can go back to councillors and go, yes, we're still having to subsidise this, we shouldn't cut it because the impact on our social care budget could be this, could be X. I think the biggest thing, or kind of request to local authorities, is they need to work with health more effectively. 68% of our journeys are health. I think it's something like 11 or 12% are funded by health. So there's a massive disparity. And we also have an issue at times, sometimes with local authorities, if CT is funded from adult social care. So I've heard this with some of our operators, particularly car schemes. They're funded by social care. They're not allowed to do health journeys. Because health should be funding that. And that's a real challenge, you know, kind of around budgets and how they're managed.
And you mentioned earlier the issue of, well, the potential, shall we say, for some of the clarification of the lack of reference to CT in the bus bill coming forward in the statutory guidance. That sounds like an important point for this committee to consider as we continue to scrutinise the bus bill quite separately to this. I've got two more supplementaries, if I may. Can I just go back to what you said about this OPEX, CAPEX thing? I mean, I'm sort of been relatively frightened in the last 12 months of what I've discovered about the sort of depths of digital ignorance amongst government and Parliament and also local authorities. My council appears to be excited about the prospect of commissioning its own public transport app, which sort of defies all common sense. It sounds like what you said might be the reason for this is that they can actually justify paying some enormously overpriced consultancy company £250,000 to build something that's actually valueless because they can capitalise it, whereas they can't find 25 grand a year for a subscription for a software product. Is it that bad? Is that really influencing decisions in that way?
We get a lot of feedback, from our members for lots across transport technology, so anything that uses digital software and is trying to sell into local authorities. Some local authorities find clever ways of capitalising operational expenditure, and there are ways of doing it. I'm not sort of well versed in the accountancy of it, but you can do it in some cases. But it does seem to act as a barrier, and you know, it's sometimes quite ironic that, you know, now things like Microsoft Tools, Word, and things like that are being used by local authorities on a software as a service basis. But when it comes to looking at something like understanding a road layout and the condition of the road using a software as a service monitoring system that lots of our members provide, that seems hard to purchase, and I think that's a real issue that we are seeing across things, across the sector.
It might be beyond even Deloitte to suggest they might be commissioned to build a word processing software tool for a fee. So I'll leave that bit there. But just coming back, thank you for that, to the question of funding. Just on fares, could a structured fare solution help to deliver more long-term financial sustainability for the sector, do you think?
So a third of our members currently receive no income from fares.
Right.
So the fare model within CT operators is really kind of split. Some fares are over £7. Some operators don't charge a fare because they'll get funding from elsewhere. Particularly in rural areas, some of the operators are doing really long journeys. If you were going to charge that out at a fare rate of what it cost, it wouldn't be sustainable for the passengers to kind of keep using it. And I think we did a small scale passenger survey, which we're just about to release the data from, but around half of the passengers wouldn't travel, so 46% wouldn't travel if they didn't have CT. And so they just wouldn't travel. So they wouldn't get a taxi, they wouldn't have friends or family, they just wouldn't travel. So that's potentially a proportion. And then you've got about a third of them that might pick up using taxis, but they said if they used a taxi, they might only travel once rather than 2 or 3 times a week because it's cheaper. So if we put the fares up, we would just get less passengers potentially. So then it still isn't sustainable. So either way, and actually we're here to ensure people get out and about. We're not a commercial service, so we're not driven by that. I think our standpoint often is community transport services will have to be subsidised by somebody, whether it's local authority, whether it's a grant fund, whether it's donation, whether it's sponsorship. It can't run. It's not a commercial service. It cannot run on fares.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
I promised we'd go back to VAT, so a special one for Max. How do current VAT rules impact the viability of DRT services?
Yeah, sure. So VAT is different for public service vehicles, which a lot of sort of bus vehicles use, and private hire vehicles, which are smaller vehicles. What that means for DRT services is if they choose to use smaller vehicles, which may be more suitable for a particular area, they get charged VAT, or they have to charge VAT on fares, which makes them, a lot of local authorities choose not to do that. And there is a huge number of costs from using PSVs, which are larger vehicles, need particular driving licences from the driver, so you're recruiting from a smaller pool of people, and also there's things like fuel costs as well. So roughly we think that there's about a 30% cost increase from using a PSV over a PHV. It's worth saying we've been submitting, there was an inquiry, a consultation on this that the Treasury were running under the last government to look at PHV VAT, and part of that did include something on DRT, and we submitted a response to that saying that we think that we should reduce the VAT on private hire vehicles, make a small change to the VAT Act to allow PSV and PHVs to be treated the same, and that would also make DRT non-VAT applicable in the same way that all other public transport is. We're not sure where that consultation is with HMRC and Treasury, but we think it's actually quite a small change that wouldn't have very big tax revenue implications. A lot of local authorities aren't using PHVs for this very reason, that they get charged VAT. So it'd be minimal tax revenue that would change, but also would give more flexibility to local authorities to use the right size of vehicle that they need. And we've been talking a lot about the benefits of flexibility. This seems to be a regulatory issue that is ultimately blocking that flexibility for local authorities. It's just worth saying that it does have wider implications. The VAT is one element, but we've heard from local authorities since we've started working on this issue about other things that have come up because of that PHV-PSV divide, and additional forms not quite sort of being correct because they're catering for one or the other, the things around bus lane usage and things like that. So there are more issues that are coming out from this, but the VAT is kind of a more immediate one.
Absolutely. So do you think that there is a need perhaps then for a distinct regulatory framework for DRT? Because at the moment, basically, you're suggesting that it's using either bus or taxi legislation because it's never really been thought about in and of its own.
I think there could be something for a definition of DRT that provides that and allows local authorities to use that. And what I would say is we have to be a bit careful, because we wouldn't want a definition of DRT to impact the flexibility of the service. I've kind of described the huge number of varieties of DRT schemes, zonal and all of that type of thing. You wouldn't want a definition to kind of put in place a structure that didn't fit that. You want to be able to provide as much flexibility to the sector. But there's definitely something that needs to be done to kind of stop this divide and make it easier for local authorities.
Can I come in on that? Because I think it's quite important from our point of view to kind of flag that we strongly don't support DRT-specific legislation around operation. DRT is a mode of transport that is delivered by a number of operators, and so if you were to put into place legislation that only covered DRT, it would, I suspect, highly likely conflict with the current non-commercial kind of setups. I think it's really important to look at the kind of operators and the types of services that operators can deliver, because commercial and non-commercial operators both deliver DRT. So if you were to have DRT-specific legislation, it would need to take into account not just PHV and PSV, but Section 19 and Section 22 as well. And I think you're going into a bit of a minefield there, if I'm honest. So I think it's better looking at the kind of operator level legislation, and actually do those operator legislations enable those to deliver that flexible type of service, as opposed to kind of a mode specific legislation.
I think that comes into the concerns around the flexibility of this whole sector, really, actually, yeah, and that we need to be very careful with all of this.
Okay, thank you, because ultimately it's the passengers and potential passengers that matter. Okay, Katie.
Thank you, Chair. We touched on this in a couple of questions, but it would be great to hear the best examples of demand-responsive transport outside this country, so anything internationally, any schemes that are particularly well run. And then within the UK as well, Mr Sugarman mentioned Milton Keynes already, but any others maybe keen to hear about Hearts Links and what the teams learned in Hertfordshire, and whether there are any themes or lessons across different schemes of what works well that we could learn.
I'll touch on Hearts Links and then a couple of ones from abroad that we work on. So I think what Hearts Links have done is really look at the bus network they have today, look at what could be done when they were awarded bus service improvement funds and also the Rail Mobility Fund. And the way that service has worked is, now we have elements where if you want to travel within an urban centre, relatively urban as Hertfordshire goes, places like Stevenage and Bishop Stortford, those journeys are not possible by DRT because we want to complement the existing bus network, and we're focused instead on those really isolated places, in the sticks, so to speak, but then they can get to the towns and then make onward journeys, and 1 in 8 journeys being picked up at railway stations or bus stations, and 1 in 4 are being dropped off. So again, we're still seeing it's not like for like 1 in 4 in each way, but we're also seeing elements where sort of journey penalties of previous iterations. So there was previously a bus service that was running every 3 hours down the core of the Hearts Link zone, which if you're trying to access places of work or GP appointments, that's not very practical. And what we did was look at a piece of work with them around okay, what's the private car time between those point A and point B, and it might be 30 minutes, and then we looked at how we work our algorithm with them with DRT and make that 40 minutes, 45 minutes, that flexibility around how long is amenable to someone if they're willing to not take the private car, but equally the bus would be a 3-hour wait or you have to be there 2 hours early. And I think they've also built in some of the school transport services, so a couple of schools are served each day and they're sort of blocked out because they have a sort of slightly larger fleet than some other authorities. 1 or 2 vehicles are serving specific schools in the morning and afternoon, and that again helps grow the service and grow the awareness. And then those people, I think it's sort of a secondary school, but then sixth form colleges are also quite popular for journeys. There's kind of multiple different use cases and multiple different types, and indeed even on Saturdays it's a really busy day, one of the busiest days of the week for the service. So that leisure journey, that different type of use, and perhaps leaving the car at home and parents taking children to sports centres and other activities are really being taken forward and improved. And I think more broadly, some of our experience working abroad, it's again about what's the best need for that transport service at that time of day. Some work we're doing with the authorities of the Greater Copenhagen area. They know that a lot of their residents in the town want to access the train station. They've got census data or other open data forms to show that a large number commute, and so the service is almost exclusively designed, sort of 66% of the fleet, for train stations in the morning and afternoon, and they kind of communicated in an effective marketing piece to what we were talking about earlier, that leisure journeys are perhaps not so time constrained, and they are trying to design the service to meet needs for all, but there are some more pressing times than others.
So if I just add to that, the example we used in our evidence, which was Dallas-Fort Worth in the US, they had a lot of their residents and workforce about a mile away from any public transport. So the member Uber Transit that supported that was ultimately about getting a public transport provision available for people who don't have many other options apart from private vehicle. And they've had some really strong statistics come back, things like 50% increase in public transport usage, so half is massive, and also increasing the ridership by 10%. So really, it's the largest growth of public transit in Texas that they've seen, and 25% modal shift from private car to public transport as well. So that's had really strong implications over quite a large area where there's not many other public transport options available, and I think shows that this is being done very well. What's worth saying is when we look overseas, we do see long-term funding and larger areas being the trend, and it does help and mean that schemes are being managed and delivering quite effectively.
Okay, thank you. Baggy.
Okay, just talking a bit around data and stuff. So, the potential of mass mobility as a service platforms, what potential have they got to improve rural services?
So I think there's lots of ability to improve rural services, and coming back to what we said, really MAS is about providing lots of different options for someone to use and being able to choose which one suits them based on a variety of criteria. It's giving basically people more choice. We have seen that there's a range of different ways that MAS is being provided in the UK. We do see some DRT and transport providers coming in and partnering with local authorities and offering MAS as a service there as a product that a local authority can use. We've seen that future transport zone sort of structure where there was this £90 million of funding for 4 areas. We've seen some procure mobility as a service apps and platforms, and we've also seen a lot of private sector engagement in this space. So more and more, you've got some of the ride-hailing apps that are adding on services onto their platform, so that you don't just have to book a taxi, but you could book a train ticket as well. So that integration is really, really valuable. The one thing I would say on MAS is that it's, in terms of the government's support for it, the future transport zones were good for testing it, but again, it's another trial that has seen really good schemes and MAS applications rolled out. There's a really fantastic app in Solent, for example, but we're not thinking maybe about this as strategically as we could, and we did really support the INTS. We were called for it in our manifesto before the general election, because it does give a chance for us to look at integrated transport as a whole, and the vision is really to get to a point where you have just more seamless travel across modes, and I think particularly focusing on between modes is the critical element here. You go to places like Switzerland and there's far more seamless travel across ticketing in terms of timetables, in terms of passenger information, and I think that's something that we would like to see in the UK too.
Okay. I think perhaps just to touch on that is about that data point again that you mentioned as the headline, but also collecting that data and using and interpreting that data in the correct manner. So how can we understand how, from a mobility as a service application, people want to travel versus how people are travelling now? Now can we use that, us as a software provider and us working with our local authority partners, to sort of inform how we need to change and adjust and tweak service, because we know that, for example, a lot of people want to travel at 8 o'clock, or DRT more broadly, we've seen the peaks change as we move out of the pandemic, and we kind of don't necessarily see a broad peak at 8 to 10 a.m. It's kind of sustained with a smaller peak, and how can we use that to sort of direct the transport offering that best suits the residents?
Okay, I'll come back to data in a second, but just on MAS, look, I didn't know what that meant until I read the papers for this meeting.
For example, how we should ban acronyms.
Yeah, but even if you said mobility as a service, that really didn't mean much to me either. Would there be an issue if we change this to digital journey planning and called it that? Would there be any detriment in doing that?
So we have, funny enough, a MAS forum in our as something we offer for the members for them to meet, and there's a big debate even within there whether MAS is the right term. You can call it what you will: integrated transport, digital journey planning. I think the general sense of more connected, integrated transport is really what we're all talking about. I tend to agree that the acronyms probably can, in some ways, not help as much as sort of what the meat of the issue.
Okay, cool. Okay, then maybe James, just back to you again on the role of data, whether it's AI, data science, sensing technology, and stuff. So, both for giving more information to passengers, but also helping operators plan services. What crucial role does data play in that?
I think it's really vital, and it's something that we work a lot with our our authority is on when they look to expand or change or reposition how their service are. We go through the data with them around, for example, do you need to go across this, to change the boundary of where the service goes? Do we want to go across this A road because it's a town or a village? We've got the data to show people want to travel from there. Do people want to travel in the evening? Do we need to run evening services? That sort of thing. And I think it's also around, on the AI point, kind of predicting that level of demand. How are people booking? Are people always booking right up to the last minute? Are people traditionally booking, 4 hours in advance? How can we best meet the needs? Because ultimately, all these changes we need to take on board, because then, like I touched on earlier, the service becomes much cleaner for the user as the service progresses throughout its lifetime.
Just to kind of go into that, obviously I've made the point about us kind of not always being engaged with some of these things, but, because our operators typically, so the majority of our operators use Section 19, which means it's a pre-bookable service, and therefore you collect data on the individual. And because most of the services are kind of end-to-end, we know where they live, we know exactly how many miles they've travelled, we know how many times they've travelled those miles, we know what their journey is for. So there's really, we were part of the Tackling Loneliness Fund that DFT put out kind of the other year, and the level of data they asked on the passengers in terms of their age, their ethnicity, where they were going, how many times they were going, what vehicle they went on, we've got all of that data, and it's all sitting there, and our CT operators have it, and nobody's getting it. And it's such rich data, because it would really show you, for those individuals that have got real transport barriers, so it isn't just my rural bus has stopped and I haven't got a car, people who really, no matter if you had that bus 20 times a day, wouldn't get on it. For those people, we've got all of that information, but our members are small, so getting it off them is difficult, because they all use very different methods of collecting and recording. And even just the definition of a trip is different across different people. Is it a return? That's the big debate. Yeah. But if we were able to gather that information and share that information out, it could be quite transformational from our point of view. We're doing some kind of small-scale pilots around how we can get some of it, so we can track trends around it. Our operators, the majority of our operators do evenings, they do weekends, they do bank holidays. It's not a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 service in all cases. How can we share that out? And it's something kind of I really want to try and get us to do from a CT sector, but there's just a couple of barriers in the way. We've got the social value kind of bit, so there's data around social value. So there's the Ealing Community Transport Social Value Toolkit, which is specifically designed for community transport operators. It could be tweaked for local authority services. It's not quite, the metrics of the finances aren't quite set up for council funded services, because they make judgments on the impact on council funding. But that in itself will be looking at passenger journeys, mileage. So we've got, it's kind of all there. We just need something to support bringing it out and putting it into the rest of the system is the challenge.
Just finalise on that point then. So how well are DRT and CT systems plugged into any sort of commercial planning tools?
Relatively isolated at the moment, just because DRT is still seen as DRT as opposed to sort of wider passenger transport network. What we do see is if people are looking to make journeys that replicate the bus route, we sort of tag those and we can share those with the authority. I think sometimes what that will inform is changing the design of the service, but again, to Caroline's point, we have all this data and we provide it. It's just sometimes it's our role here as a software provider to sort of guide and inform the local authority on the next steps of that.
So within the bus bill is the setup of the kind of the public data portal. I know that's not the right wording for it, but so that is something that DFT is kind of actively working on. So we've had a conversation with them about, so that would pull in data from the commercial operators about their operation, and we're having a conversation about how we can voluntarily put in information from our operators, so that actually if somebody wanted to see what was being delivered in their service, in their area, they would have access to that. But we wouldn't be required to put that information in. The bus bill is making it a requirement for commercial operators. We're looking at kind of, can we voluntarily add our data into that to improve it?
Thank you, Maggie. Alex, you had a question.
Yeah, so throughout this, we've been talking about DRT, and it feels like it sounds expensive, basically. So you've got 95% of councils saying that DRT schemes are operating at a loss. But I'm wondering if that's because it's the way we're using DRT or whether it's inherently expensive. Because a lot of this conversation has been about people who, have or would use concessionary bus passes. We had mention of a passenger that it takes 10 minutes to get aboard. We've talked about the social value. We've talked about places that used to have supported buses. So all the places that are expensive, whatever you do, frankly. Is there also a role for DRT where it actually might make money, be profitable, or at least break even? Because part of our inquiry as well is not just looking about the most remote places or the people who it's hardest to help, but also about those sort of small market towns or bigger towns where there is a much bigger group of passengers who presumably could be grouped together to move around. So is it inherently expensive, or is it just that councils are procuring services to help a certain group of people who are expensive to help?
Well, I would say, first of all, it isn't inherently expensive in that I mentioned a few examples of where it is competing in terms of level of subsidy with fixed route buses and actually reducing over time and becoming more and more efficient. In terms of subsidy, I think the points you mentioned, a lot of DRT is used to fill the gaps where other modes of public transport aren't going to be commercially provided. So it's right that we do that in terms of other economic benefits. And it's worth just saying the metrics, cost per resident served is one of the metrics we've had members tell us would be far more effective rather than just passenger subsidy, because you'd be talking about how an area is being served rather than sort of maybe just how much you're paying per passenger who's taking the journey, and that would be a bit more sort of intelligent way of calculating this. I think in terms of profitable routes, we do know there are profitable routes as well. I can come back to you. I know there's one in Kent which was, I think, operating at a profit, but I would need to come back and check with you.
I think more broadly, rather than the expensive nature of them, I think, like Max was saying, around thinking about it more, generally, that there are elements where we reduce the cost per passenger, but also we are at a point where we are operating services where traditional bus services are no longer deemed viable to run. So how can we support them? And I think with the things like the Integrated National Transport Strategy, that will actually help create the environment for things to go forward.
That's kind of my point. Why are they only in places where traditional bus services aren't viable? Are there not examples of DRT in places where traditional bus services are viable, i.e. where there's more passengers, and then presumably they would be less expensive to run?
That's a good question. Yes, I think there are. I'm sure there could be cases where actually you have a commercially viable bus service that could be using DRT as well. It shouldn't. I agree with you that actually we shouldn't be looking at this fundamentally by kind of whether we should be looking about it by what passengers need, and that should come first and foremost. And if a more flexible service is what they need through DRT, then that's what a local authority should be providing.
Hey, I mean, you're sort of coming to my last, which is rounding up the question, because we've had a lot of detailed answers to elements around the services, but really we're back to the original purpose of this inquiry, which is how do we ensure that people, particularly in rural areas and away from the centre of the main conurbations, can actually move around to the thing, and live their lives in the way they need to, in the context of a declining fixed public bus service. So I guess it's a very open question. Many of your answers have more or less answered this, but anything else you want to add to the question, which is, should DRT and community transport be recognised as core parts of the public transport network rather than seen as alternative services? Caroline, you can go first.
The short answer is yes. I mean, we advocate already that community transport is part of the public transport offer, because, as I've made that point, actually you can have lots and lots of buses running, but there will be people that won't be able to walk to that bus. You can have lots of trains, people can't even walk to the train station. Actually, we provide that accessible form of transport. It's if we were designing a transport system that was accessible for every single person in this country, we would not have one mode of transport. So historically, our public transport system has been really one mode of transport, which is a fixed route bus. And then anything outside of the fixed route bus has been seen as a nice to have, a luxury, something a bit special or different, or that there's something wrong with you because you can't get on the bus. So therefore, you have to have this special service that we've kind of set up. Whereas actually, people's lives change. Something can happen to any of us tomorrow and we might not be able to get on that bus. Our lives change, and we should have a public transport system that reflects that has different modes of transport, and each operator and each mode is equally important to the people that use it. And if we designed that system for everybody, then we wouldn't be having a discussion of should DRT have its own specific legislation, should CT have its own legislation. We're looking at what is the different modes of transport and how are we enabling them to happen.
Thank you. James?
I think Caroline put that really well, and I know the call for evidence was on buses connecting communities, and I think DRT is an element in that. It's almost transport connecting communities, and how can different types of models, and whether that's software that we work with or software that Caroline and her CT partners are working with, to enable people to travel where they need to. If that's multimodal journey planning, if that's digital journey planning like with mobility service, it's just how can we enable the whole ecosystem for people to sort of be more integrated and easier for them to travel.
So I would agree with everything that's been said. I think for DRT to be taken as a core component of the transport network, we do want to see that sustainability, the long-term funding that can help DRT thrive. We want to look at the regulations around PHV and PSV and see how they can be overcome. A consideration of those metrics and thinking more than just subsidy per passenger. And then finally that integration into the integrated national transport strategy and making sure that it's involved in that strategy and what the government's planning in terms of seamless travel for passengers.
Great, thank you, and thank you very much for your answers this morning. And please do feel free to write to us with anything you feel you've not been able to cover fully in your answers. I think we've all found this session really valuable, and before I close I just want to point out for anybody watching or reading the transcript, we've opened an online public engagement survey to give people a way of feeding into the buses inquiry, and this will be open until the 30th of March, and the link is on the Transport Committee website. So that concludes today's meeting. Order, order.